It gives me great honor and pleasure to be opening the last panel of the symposium entitled Thinking at the Crossroads. And indeed, I am not Smaro Camarelli either. She was sadly unable to make it at the last minute, and so I'm stepping in to moderate. So our speakers this afternoon are Joshua Whitehead, here on my immediate right, and then Suzette Mayr went over at the end of the table, Marlon Simmons. And I'll just do a brief bio for each. So, Joshua Whitehead is an Ojibwe Nekia member of the Peguis First Nation, Treaty 1 in Manitoba. He's currently a doctoral student here at the University of Calgary, my very own, if I may brag, where he focuses on Indigenous literatures and cultures. He's the author of the wonderful poetry book, Full Metal Indigiqueer, as well as the forthcoming Johnny Appleseed. And then you've met my colleague, Suzette Mayr, but I will introduce her again. She's the author of 5 novels, including the most recent, her most recent book, Dr. Edith Vane and the Hares of Crawley Hall. Woo! Love it. Her novel, Monoceros, won the Relit and the City of Calgary W.O. Mitchell Awards and was nominated for the 2011 Fuller Prize, as well as the Farrell Grumley Award for LGBT Fiction and the George Bugnett Award for Fiction. Her novel, The Widows, was a finalist for the Commonwealth Prize for Best Book in the Canada-Caribbean region. She is a former president of the Writers Guild of Alberta and has been teaching creative writing here at the University of Calgary since 2003. And last, but by far not least, Marlon Simmons is an assistant professor in the Workland School of Education, also here at the University of Calgary. His research interests include diaspora and culture, governance of the self, and communicative network practices of youth. So I think we're just going to go with the order in the program, which is also the order along the table instead of right to left. Yes, indeed, right. My right to left, your left to right. So we'll start with Joshua.
So thanks everyone, hello. My name is Joshua Whitehead. Sigaso, Peguis First Nation, Manitoba, Tante Ochinia, that's where I'm from. So I was a little overwhelmed, I think, in being asked to be a part of this panel. I didn't want to take up a lot of space. And I didn't think it was a lot of my knowledge and stories were that applicable to the types of work that we're trying to do in terms of relationalities, in terms of Black politics and Indigenous politics, and the fusion of the two. So instead of trying to gain any type of expertise, what I thought I could do is offer stories, more specifically from my home nation, Peguis First Nation, which is in Manitoba, but also, that's maternally, but I'm also from Mikisew Cree First Nation, Northern Alberta, paternally. So I have roots in the West Canada and in Central Canada. So I just wanted to offer stories, anecdotes, and offer my body as a type of story as well, and my land as a type of story, to think about how, Indigenous, Black, and the fusion of the two futurities here on Turtle Island. So I changed my talk a little bit. I've now called it Indigenous Intimacies, Making Love to Make Live. There are snakes outside Nitanskotepan's Waskaigan, my great-grandmother's house. Thin black ribbons that look too much like burned rubber on the highways. Their bellies are the color of the muck beneath the rapids behind Nookum's house. I was always afraid of Kanipik, snake slithering in the long grass out front, the grass where the res dogs yelp and give each other love nips. Nookum's house is small, but it cradles all my cousins when we visit, 100 little Indians all sleeping in one bed. Her teacups are varied, mismatched cups from garage sales and hand-me-downs, but the tea is boiling and there are always hands in that bright yellow Lipton box. Her walls are lined with photographs, wall like an art gallery, Nookum the matriarchal curator, Nookum the Indian war hall, she stories us all into the world. Her legs are thin, veins blue as water, winding down in loose folds of pink and brown skin. I am sitting on her lap, 5 years old, which really means I've never lost myself, which really means time is not a measurement, which really means that I'm always 5 and not, which really means tomorrow is today, is yesterday, is a gift. I'm tracing the veins on her calves, veins like snakes that fork and careen in fancy designs on her skins. Nukum is a kinipig too. Those thick protruding veins wound around her frame, pumping blood, which really is a medicine, which really is an elixir, is a ceremony, is a life. To her heart, which beats a round dance song that the whole family dances to. I think of Nukum now, little Esqueu full of wonders, full of song, and hurt myself because my tea is too hot and hers is sitting in a box of knickknacks at the back of a cupboard. I cry because Nukum is a tea bag in a haphazardly open box of black Lipton tea. I cry because my veins are too shy to rise to the surface and kiss the sun. I cry because Kinipig prints language onto the land for me to read like a petroglyph, a blueprint, a set of instructions that all point me back to Mikiwam, my home. When I remember you, Nukum, I stitch myself back together again. I mold the skin that's spoiled from the year, all pink-skinned and dazzling in the light, looking for the old home, and I ask myself, ain't that the sweetest kind of medicine? I open my first book, Full Metal Indigiqueer, with the proclamation, "This is my space where my people come to transform," and ended it with the creation of what I call the decolonial hive mind by noting, I'm not sure I like the word indigenous anymore, when it simply divides, crippled, dying, by fighting each other to hold its hand. So I've decided to break it. Indig, I, Nu, Noean, Noesis, Nianin. I ask, who is indigenous? And what does indigenous mean? Who is it for? And maybe, more importantly, what does it do? Is it not regional, specific, transnational? If, as Jody Bird says, transit is an empire that mobilizes indigeneity as a mode of curated transformation and inheritance, I wonder how we, as actual indigenous peoples, can take to heart our ceremonial mandates and transform that noun, indigenous, into a verb, into action, and instead ask, how does indigeneity work? What does it do then? Of course, these politics of recognition, as argued by various Otachimao such as Glenn Coulthard, Kim Tallbear, Chelsea Vowell, Gerald Beisner, and Alicia Elliott, are understood as problematic. These politics of recognition are paternal, colonial, violent. Words like squaw, savage, Eskimo, Indian, Native, Aboriginal, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Indigenous, names I've all been called, names I've all had to go by. Is that too not a genocide? As Alicia Elliott has argued, indigenous is not a word we chose for ourselves. To call us indigenous is to categorize us. To categorize us is to racialize, and to racialize is to assimilate. I think here of President Obama's speech that we are all a land of immigrants amongst his platforms for equality and social justice. To seek that type of equality as an immigrant, a settler, or perhaps what Bird would call an arrivant, is to want to further embed oneself into the nation state, is it not? I posit my thinking along a crossroad then. What I really mean to say is I position my mind and my heart upon the land to think ethically, respectfully, and most importantly, futuristically, which is really to say I exist and think within Nehiyawiwin, the Cree language. A silk thread is stitched to another, is stitched to another, is stitched to another. Pure glitter in the moonlight like Nukum's beads. A web of glass that catches dreams as much as it does small insects. Apikisis, spider, lives in the corners of my patio, vision like a kaleidoscope, web like a galactic wall, all fourth dimensional in the third. I wonder what the world looks like in the head of a spider. Vision spliced into eights, which really means infinity, which really means a Métis optic, which really means red rivers and survivance, which really means Manitowopow, by which I really mean Wo Manitowopow, because this world isn't the only one and we don't always have to be in it. I think of Iktomi, Okimau Apikisis, chief spider, trickster spider, who spun the original World Wide Web. all sticky with feeling and smooth as a weathered pebble. I am a fly on that web as much as you are, web like a basket full of kinship, full of decolonial love, web like a network, web like a family. This is what infinity looks like. Connection is a technology indigeneity has perfected. I smoke my cigarette on the patio, eyes glued to apichesis because I am scared they will bite me, and I know this world ain't ready for no Indian apichesis nepeu. The white in me tells me to smush apichesis beneath my moccasin, but that moccasin ain't no running shoe, and apichesis is my nookum too. So I let them live. I sprinkle tobacco beneath their web. I thank them for all the work they do, which too often goes unnoticed and unpaid. I thank Spider for the good dreams and their slaying of the bloodsucker. Apichesis is a biopunk, is a cyberpunk, is a Kruger, and I think damn Nookum is one hell of a badass in the war. In February of 2015, the University of Winnipeg held a symposium titled Decolonizing and Decriminalizing Trans Genres. The topics of conversation revolved around trans people of color, Indigenous trans, and Two-Spirit people. Moreover, a screening of Dear White People was playing that evening. Prior to entering the film, there was a poster for the conference which had the word Indigenous bolded and in large print alongside a land acknowledgement for Treaty 1. Waiting, I stood reading the sign when a distraught student who noted he was an international student from Kenya approached me. Indigenous, he asked me. Who is Indigenous? I am Indigenous. I was taken aback by his comment. One, because I am, for the most part, white passing and often misrecognized, and two, because during that weekend I was coming into myself as a Nehio Two-Spirit person with the recognition of my land, my identities, my language. I was claiming that word, Indigenous, as my own in that moment. We got into an argument over the word Indigenous, about who had the right to pin it onto their identities like a bundle of medicine, who had the right to claim it, and who had the right to use it as a transit, as a verb, as a gateway. And while we both wanted to claim that word for ourselves, I understood too that his livelihood was similar to mine, all exhausted and starved for a term and a word that empowered. I think here of Alicia Keys and Alicia Elliott sharing the stage of Amnesty International this year, both speaking about the dispossession and the disposability of black and brown bodies. I think that's what Indigenous can do. To break indigeneity, that old colonial conception, which is to say contraption, which always limits the body, which limits the language, and the land of its pedagogies, its teachings, its relations, is to make a noun into a verb. In, to be inclusive within, dig, to not extract but to meld with the land, nu, to mean of the mind, noean, to shake or to tremble, noesis, to perceive, to think, to be conscious, and nianin, meaning five, the recognition of those four directions, those four colors on the medicine wheel, red, black, yellow, and white, all in relation to the me, which is a relation to the us, which is also what nianin means in Nehiawi, us, we, our. That, I think, is what indigeneity looks like, or should look like. Instead of pining over its mandated mirrors, its politics of recognition, which are always curated and laid out by the nation-state, we think of it as a locator and a locutor, a symbolic gesture to the land that claims you and to the language that names you. Am I Indigenous on Treaty 7 if I am from Treaty 1? Indigeneity is about land, and the land that loves you. It is specific, it is regional, it is global. If indigeneity as a concept is part of the master's toolkit to differentiate between civil and uncivil, black, white, between human and non-human, and between is and was, then its meaning, when embodied, becomes akin to something punk, and I wonder if that is what we were fighting over in that moment in Winnipeg. The right to the freedoms of a misrecognition, the right to an archive of trauma and resilience, to stories of survivance, which is stored and spayed within its syllables. Sometimes I think we need to be our own best medicine. If there are no words for us or spaces for us, we make them. Indigeneity is not a static thing. I think of it as a mutant, all-powerful and evolving at every turn. What if indigeneity in the era of reconciliation meant those things? A togetherness, a mutual recognition of a history and a legacy of genocide and pain, a shaking, a trembling, a love, but an understanding, a union, a hive mind. In Nehiyawi, when we differentiate language as animate or inanimate rather than masculine and feminine, and our worldview is much larger than that of English, sorry to say, a lesson from Apicius, Spider, where rocks, trees, rivers, and skies are living things, are animate, and we are thereby beholden to them, accountable to them. They are our relations. But whiteness has a knack for animation too, where it extracts history from our bones, which is to say our land, but really mean our bodies, curates it into museums and archives, skins our stories and parades them as John Wayne catch-alls, empties the land of genealogy and rewrites social progression as a series of vanishing acts. Labor is a pharmaceutical death drive, and capital is a series of monthly checks addressed to genocide. Indigeneity is a flora, is an agriculture, is a clear-cutting. So I think of old Wewa, that gorgeous Zuni two-spirit, all pasted on the pages of white queer magazines and cited in lawsuits against the nation-state as precedent, and think, ain't that an animation? Is settler queerness a white nationalism too? Whiteness loves to reanimate indigeneity where it sees fit. Just ask poor old Wenjack. This city is a graveyard, is a haunted house, is a necropolis. Teresa Spence was read as zombific from Barbara Kay, who said that she was fattening up and ain't that just precious. I think of Chanel and McQueen reanimating indigeneity into a distorted extinction runway. I think of the same politics that happened to Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign. So how do we navigate the world as the living dead? I sheath myself in Cree and hold my sweetgrass to my heart, which really means I hold Nookum, cause ain't that her gorgeous hair. I animate myself, Nehia, boy, girl, who's living, who is thriving, who is surviving, and I hold the world accountable to me for once. I remember the lessons my kin all taught me. I let myself feel and cry my way into the world. Indigenous is a rebellious word, a resistant word, and thereby too an anti-world that we cling to. That old Wapan, sun shining light onto a new horizon of possibility, a new type of world in sight, out of reach but attainable nonetheless. That type of world building, I believe, is the noun turned into a verb. To be indigenous is to be in anti-relation to the genocidal structures of feeling that Western nation states have mandated we churn our bodies, our lands, and our languages through. Maybe that's why I turn to indigeneity as a type of intimacy, as Lisa Lowe narrates for us in Intimacies of the Four Continents. Intimacy, quote, less as in the intimacies of desire, sexuality, marriage, and family, and thought more of, rather, as a concept of intimate and heuristic capabilities. It is by thinking in this vein, Lowe argues, that we might consider the political, the sexual, and the intellectual connections and relations among slaves, peoples of indigenous descent, and colonized laborers as an emergent intimacy of four continents, forged out of residual processes. I would go so far as to sing an indigenous intimacy into the world, one that we can use to distinguish the complex webs of what and who is indigenous and map out its survivance tactics present in post-contact peoplehoods such as the OG Cree, the Métis, the Cherokee Freedmen, etc. Our sexuality is vivacious, and our verb for that is to snag. A delay of... Someone got it. Our verb for that is to snag. A delay of the coming, which is to say we save up our energies to emerge into futurities. We make love in Indian time to procure a tomorrow. Our resiliency, I would argue, rests in our intimacies, which are always linked to kinship, to sexualities, to genders, to class, to language. Though, too, there is a limitation in how we should deploy these intimacies, and we must be conscious to not romanticize or idealize those Western idyllic formations of our histories. As I say, note I call for an indigenous intimacy. I do so with the intention that those intimacies reestablish and re-augment queer and or trans indigenous peoples and or two-spirits, as well as heterosexualities and cisgenders. To maintain an indigenous intimacy is to remember our sexual and gendered past that was, and to call it into the now is, to remove the stigma and the trauma around queer indigenous sex brought about by colonization and heightened in institutions like residential schools, and validate it as a medicine too, to remember our sexual pasts, such as in Manitowoc being a kind of intertribal hub of sex and decolonization, which includes bodies of color, Black, Asian, Indigenous, and Latinx all combined. And to maintain an Indigenous intimacy is also to respect the boundaries and limitations of one's own placement in an Indigenous epistemology or an Indigenous worldview. To not appropriate and to excavate to spiritedness, to call one's queerness away from its whiteness, to remove one from the universalism of liberal settler queerness, and to place them into the reanimated, romanticized genealogical individualisms of a two-spirit, intimate historicity. So to conclude, sometimes ceremony is a lone drive on the highway, and Buffy St. Marie's there telling me that God has always been afoot, that can crush and magic has never died. I drive down past Gimli and the old graffiti sign that used to read honk if you're horny, but now reads honk if you're happy. I honk either way. When I reach Narcisse, those snake dens, Guinea Pig is there too, Snake is there too. Hundreds of them reeling across the road. Their skins are loose and their scales fall off in rhythms like guitar picks cartwheeling in the wind. I pick one up, say, here, this one's for you, Buffy. You be Eagle Man and I'll be Changing Woman. And old Guinea Pig, they can have a sex drive too. All horned up and snagging in a ball, snake den like a boudoir, all womb and nerve endings. The land teaches me to live and love as my two-spirited partner. Land is an indigiqueer pedagogy, teaches me what indigeneity is, teaches me that indigeneity is a sexual primer, is a connective tissue, is a delayed come, tells me you're Niso, Manitokan, femboy surviving in Manitoa Pow, this intertribal, bi-apocalyptic, decolonial BDSM hub that will always sing you home so long as you come here, my boy, so long as you come home, so long as you keep coming home.
Okay. It's awe-inspiring to be around such talented people, and I'm a bit intimidated, I have to say. I'd like to begin by outlining my own background in a very circuitous way as a means of setting out my perspective and framework for what I'm going to talk about. And this circuitousness in a way reflects my creative writing practice, which is that I tend to, I think magpies do this, where they pick up bits and pieces. The problem with that is that sometimes things get out of context, but what I try to do is assemble a coherent whole. So here it is. I remember one day in the early 1990s when I was recently out as a lesbian, and I had my first proper girlfriend. We were walking out and about, holding hands, which was a revolutionary thing to do, a really, really hard thing for me to do, and I just kept staring at the ground so I couldn't see the expressions on people's faces and the judgment. And I remember my girlfriend suddenly exclaiming, "How sweet!" And I said, "What? What's sweet?" And she said, how sweet it was that a person we had just passed didn't look at us as they walked by. According to my girlfriend, by not looking at us, that person had paid us a great compliment, because in that person's eyes, my girlfriend and I holding hands were unremarkable. I came of age in 1970s suburban Calgary. My father an immigrant from Germany, my mother an immigrant from the Bahamas, and on our very white Calgary street, we were a family of unicorns. Most of us in our 5-member family were a different color. We all ate strange food. Some of us had foreign accents. And what I remember a lot during that time was being constantly stared at. We'd get stared at in the streets of Calgary. When we went to Germany to visit my father's family, we got stared at. When we went to the Bahamas to visit my mother's family, we'd get stared at. And it's that particular way of being stared at that lets you know you're different, you're foreign, you're strange. And I tried to negotiate it over the years and rationalize it as these people staring because I'm clearly so fabulous. I can't help staring. I was a swan, I am a swan among ducks. I'm an orchid in a field of crabgrass. And so of course I'm being stared at for my wondrousness and unusualness, and not because I'm different and threatening. Not because I'm being othered, and not because the person staring might have racist, perhaps even violent intention. So when my girlfriend in the early 90s remarked on how sweet it was that someone didn't look at us, I knew exactly what she meant. She meant that this stranger had given us the gift of being momentarily ordinary. When I was a young writer as well, I remember the whole debate around writing issues. So the early 90s also coincides with me coming into writing. I remember the whole debate around writing issues, or issues, as my friends and I would say. I can't remember if it was in writing workshops or if it was a writer giving a talk about writing or just some editing feedback I got or someone else got. But one piece of feedback that I witnessed again and again about my own work and other people's work, fellow writers like Hiromi Goto, who was also starting out at that time, was that our work couldn't be about too many issues. That is, you could write about race or queerness or gender, but you couldn't write about two of those things at the same time. You really couldn't write about all of three things because then your writing would be about too many issues. It would be considered too didactic, too obvious, or worst of all, boring and alienating. As a queer, biracial woman, it was hard then to write poetry or fiction that spoke about me because I am a great big ball of issues. When I have the time, and so this is me getting magpie, I watch a lot of movies, and because I'm a particularly shallow human being when it comes to Hollywood, I can't help caring about Hollywood and the films that come out and who's wearing what, and who's dating whom, and who those films represent and who they don't represent. And I'm not saying anything new at all when I comment about how the big budget films that represent black people are usually ones about slavery or about black suffering. And in 2013, Roxane Gay summed it up perfectly in an article called "Where Are the Serious Movies About Non-Suffering Black People?" in which she laments that the only movies that feature black characters that seem to get attention are slave narratives like 12 Years a Slave, or movies that aren't slave narratives but are also about black pain called The Help. The Help. And as a writer in Canada, I can't help wondering, and I might get in trouble for this because I know some people really love this book, but as a writer in Canada, I can't help wondering about books like Lawrence Hill's Book of Negroes that got so much attention, won so many awards, and was so popular it was made into a mini-series on CBC. I can't help but wonder if the huge popularity of the Book of Negroes was because it is a book about a familiar, predictable topic when it comes to black people. It was about one big issue, uncomplicated by other issues, and that's what made it more palatable for the general public. But that's another conversation. Perhaps it's something we can talk about today or not. So, as a fiction writer, I have been really hungry for practical advice on how to write about issues without being boring or alienating. I am hungry for how to not care about being boring, hungry for practical advice on how to write in an inclusive, non-staring way, and in a way that stops my world from, my fiction work, from reproducing segregated worlds. I refuse to write segregated fiction. I am hungry for advice on how to write fictional Indigenous characters in a way that doesn't perpetuate stereotype, that isn't appropriative. It is with a great sense of despair that I read articles by non-Indigenous writers that discuss the importance of research when writing about Indigenous characters, because research is important, but then outline a writing process that just seems to further tokenize and reduce racialized people. But one ray of hope of all of this, was an essay I read also in the early 90s by Paul Chapp-Smith titled Home of the Brave. And in this essay, Chapp-Smith calls to the fore stereotypes that perpetuate, quote, what you call the continued trivialization and appropriation of Indian culture, the absolute refusal to deal with us as just plain folks living in the present and not in the past, end quote. So, what I am proposing as a fiction writing strategy, just one fiction creative writing strategy, and I'd love to hear people's feedback on this, is so what I'm proposing is to write my own experiences though black people, in particular queer black women, are plain folks, in writing First Nations and Inuit characters who are plain folks, even unremarkable folks. In my novel Venus Hum, they are the fellow queer Indigenous former student named Lloyd Weaselhead at a 20-year high school reunion who happily dances to bad 80s music and fraternizes with zombies. In my novel, Dr. Edith Vane and the Hares of Crawley Hall, Inuit professor Dr. Olivia Tutu is just another plain folk who wears fashionable shoes and makes bad romantic choices. And she has as her colleague Dr. Edith Vane, an insecure, messed up black lesbian professor who is so disorganized she can't even manage to get her washing machine fixed. My provocation, my invitation, my proposition, my argument is that writing a racially minoritized character, a character with issues, can also sometimes mean writing about plain folk, perhaps even unremarkable folk. By not turning a violent, othering gaze on these characters, by not following the familiar violent story paths, I would like to think that I'm working to make room for fuller, more complete characterization in fiction. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Larissa. So firstly, I'd like to begin by thanking the first peoples of the land, the original peoples of the land. I think that's very important to situate our narrative historically, so we come to understand our narratives, our histories, how we come to know, right, as imbued through epistemological completeness. I also like to thank Anita for reminding us about the importance of the relationship of the land with the land. Just sharing those sensibilities so we can understand practices and how we come to understand questions of spirituality. I think that's very important. I'd like to thank Larissa and Suzette for the pedagogical intervention, the necessity for these conversations, for bringing us together in a type of solidarity to speak about these moments. Not necessarily waiting for the institution to validate our experience, for the institution to intervene. Right? So I think this is very much important. I'm honored to be a non and wit dialogue with the panelists, and also thank you to everyone attending so that we could come together and construct meaning. So upon the invitation spoke about sharing your thoughts, provocations, a working draft type thing, not necessarily a paper, right? So today I didn't prepare a paper. I sort of titled it Notes from the Diaspora, Interests, Thoughts, Provocations, Sensibilities, right? So I'm more sharing my thoughts, my internal dialogue, self-dialogue, just rough thoughts. Also, before I begin, rather than a monologue, I'm inviting everyone to participate, so you can jump in when you can. As well, I want to try and interstitch the conversation with previous conversations, right? To sort of tie up, just being cognizant of time. And that doesn't reduce the role, I think, of the moderator, but if we could suggest gently. So let me begin so a bit more, I think, just rough points. So I want to say I'm interested in the ways in which Black life come to understand questions of belonging and what it means to be human through intergenerational knowledge, shared histories, and collective consciousness imminent to the African diaspora. So that's what's imminent, or within the African diaspora. And in doing so, I think I'm reminded with what Larissa said earlier, that I'm stating my intentions, right, as Larissa learned from the elder. So those I think, in particular, are my intentions. I'm also concerned with the relational experiences of Black life regarding questions of the self, as the self comes to be historically contoured through the social terrain of the immutable cultural constellations of human modernity, right? So I think we need to get a sense of a post-Columbus moment within the last 500 years to chart, right, this particular configuration of how we come to know our particular governing public sphere, right? So I think that draws on some of what David is saying about coming to understand the present, Black in the present. Also what Joshua is reminding us about coming into the self, okay? And I'm thinking about Blackness, one, as immutable, right? Because that's constructed through Euromodernity. At the same time, it's made mutable, right? I think a critical engagement. So I think we want to touch on Chris's notion of that malleability of Blackness and what we do with it and how we come to push back, right? So in particular, I'm curious how belonging as a spatio-temporally shifting concept contested and historically implicates how Black life experienced civic participation in this globalized context of the nation state. Right? So my purpose here in a sense is to extricate Black life from a very specific rigid, ontological rigidity of a homogeneous socialization, right, as shaped through this hegemonic Eurocentric cultural practices of modernity. So Black life is what? Fixed to what? Plantation geographies, plantation materiality, that which ought to be propertized, right, as a particular being, right? And infused within society as forming scaffolding relationships, hierarchized relationships, right? So those are some of the moments I want to be working through. I also want to understand the selective communicative practices that come to self-determine civic participation of Black peoples, right, within Tutu Island. Right? And I think writing in that context is very important, right? I think in particular what Suzette just spoke about, writing a Black narrative in a particular way, it's a selective communicative practice, right, to undo these hegemonic traditions, yet at the same time not being fixed to a type of bifurcation that Rain is inviting us to think of, right? Ultimately reducing itself to a kind of segregated narrative, right? So I think that's, I wanted to touch on that. So I'll continue. So concerning the human in the context of Black people, I am suggesting we ought to consider how belonging reveals itself through these myriad lived contingencies within the African diaspora, right? As augured through colonization, oral histories, cultural ways of knowing, indigenous knowledge, local languages, religion, as Rain just pointed out, land, ancestral lineage, and questions of spirituality, right? That we ought to consider how these contingencies, when colonially uprooted by way of a type of transatlantic enslavement, becomes integrated or alienated within the globalized epoch of Tutu Island, right? Which in a sense is producing conditions of possibility for what it means to be human for Black people. Right? So concerning Blackness, I think I need to say that to me, and Rain was touching on this, that to me Blackness is not limited or reduced to a type of corporeality, right? Or that speaks to hue, that speaks to here, a particular kind of type. I think Blackness is very much involves an interstitch historical reading, right? And we're working through that, right? I think Chris was pushing us to think about that through a particular writing or a particular telling of story that Joshua touched on, a particular body, people's a story to rewrite, hey, how we come to understand the sense of Blackness, right? So that's one. I want to continue. I recognize central to the performative practices of belonging, the agentizing acts of being human as, right? So belonging now as cryptically scripted through Enlightenment narratives of modernity. So we come to belong, and Gramsci is important here, right? That Enlightenment modernity has left in us infinite traces, right? And our task is to left in us infinite traces without an inventory. And it shapes how we come to know. So part and parcel of our task when we are writing, I think is working to undo those moments, right? So how might we understand variant Black subjectivities as experienced through situational boundaries, contingent events with the interstices of nation-state Canada, Tutu Island, and particular practices imminent to the African diaspora, right? And how do we make sense of the ways in which Black youth, Black life, come to be situated, and at the same time, how do Black subjectivities stabilize different political identities through particular historical, philosophical, political paradigms, right? I think in that moment I was drawn to some of which Cheryl was talking about and what Reid was talking about, understanding these particular Black subjectivities, but they're very much what? Informed, shaped through a type of historical reading, right? So I think Cheryl's inviting us very much that, hey, if we understand Black life, we ought to place a historical trajectory on that moment. The reading begins, right? And from that reading, we're reading through what? From, with, through, out, and against those conjectures, those nomenclatures, right? So I'm thinking aloud, very oral, right? So there me jump in a little bit. So in that moment that Cheryl and Wade is inviting us to think about, I think it involves some arduous work. It involves thinking about what it means to have an invested interest in Black life. And in terms of, and I think Chris touched on this, the social science research methods we utilize within the educational context of Black life. And in doing so, what particular political identities are challenged, made secure, durable, and privileged. So if we're talking about Black life, and we decide to take up a post-structuralist framework or a Derridian framework, right? It becomes very shirkable, right? Very shirkable. When it comes to take up Black life through anti-colonial or anti-racist or an indigenous framework, or the idea of telling story, right? Qualitative research is always already suspect, right? So how and what, when we come to think about what knowledge counts, right? The epistemological questions of how we come to know where knowledge resides and the embodied moment, it becomes, to write Black life by way of story, it becomes very suspect, right? I think we need to identify some of these moments as we write. At the same time, I think I need to say a declarative statement, especially in this English department. I'm not a writer. All the T writer, I just want to put that out, but I think I come to it with a type of thinking and understanding of reality. So I just wanted to put that out with the esteemed writers here. And I say to that type of humility, right? So with the African diaspora procuring different geographic locations of Black life, belonging then becomes experienced through memory of the colonial past and present, and through an embodiment of knowledge as ontologically embedded within cultural artifacts, practices, and variant attachments to the African diaspora. I think that's very much Lisa Lowe's moment, and she's inviting us to think about the intimacies of 4 continents. And indeed, as method, she engages artifacts, right? Everyday artifacts, a type of socio-material construct to understand quotidian everyday moments that at best may not be read as apolitical or historical. It may not be read through a narrative or a vacuum. It's very much laden, filled with what? Trauma and pain, right? And questions, as Karina said, of mourning. So I think part and parcel of our work is to come to understand mourning, right? Question of lament, right? As David was talking with us, through these artifacts, right, and identify them. I want to push a little bit more. I'm suggesting we need to think about the modes of inclusion and exclusion that govern the relational, socio-cultural public sphere of Black life. That in doing so, we need to dialectically, by dialectically I'm thinking about in relation, right? And that's very much interstitched in our conversation in each passage, right? We need to dialectically place the communities of Black life in relation to colonialism, settler nation state, Eurocentric immigration policies, and anti-colonial practices to historically trace the socio-cultural relation of Black communities as inscribed through the colonial forays embedded within imperial immigration policy. So that's within imperial immigration policies. But I think, hey, Wade's example is key here. How do we understand that game? That game is very much scripted through a type of colonial repository, right? Laden with practices, right? Cryptically scripted, right? Epistemologically infused, arranged within that game. So I think, Wade, you're doing some work there to come to reify those entanglements and asking us to think through those moments, right? Regarding Black life, I'm also concerned with how contemporary questions of governance by way of particular sociocultural practices come to inform everyday communicative exchange of Black people, right? In a sense then, what are the ways in which Black life becomes governed through primordial roots as historically imbued through shared collective consciousness of the African diaspora? I think so. I'm sort of invoking this idea of primordial roots, a type of, and I thought that was infused in the different narratives and stories shared. A type of, not necessarily reducing to an origin, but a type of history that's embedded in our thinking. So Suzette's narrative started with a fusion with different locations, right? I like how Rain puts it with cultural continuity, right? But there's a type of locus or loci infused within that cultural continuity that's forming a vector, a type that's honing our thinking. I think there's a type of ontological location we're working through, right? I want to make 2 points. So what then does it mean for black life to come to know through a corporeality, right, which is the black materiality, that has been historically situated, right, as Wade would remind us, as abject, as socio-materially ontological, right, to draw on Nadine's point, to plantation geographies, as dehumanized through colonial epistemologies, right? I think that's what Chris is writing back to. That's the sense I'm getting, right? That this blackness is scripted with a particular narrative, right? Through these intimate geographies, we are left to make sense of how black life and nation states simultaneously come to recognize each other, right? So last point in thinking aloud. Furthermore, my concern with belonging, black life and being human is that it seems to be always already discursively positioned within spaces of the West, replete with a desire to consume the colonial harvest of globalization, and eagerly willing to be immersed within the techno-capitalist sphere of our contemporary social environment. Right? And where I'm going with that is that it seemed to survive or to come to self-determination or questions of development and recovery when it comes to black life is that always already the conclusion speaks to a particular form of exceptionalism, right? So I get sort of concerned here that us as scholars, and Bertrand, we're having that talk in this thing, us as scholars, we very much positioned or situated in a space of exceptionalism, right? We've got all type of award-winning writers here, right? And those if you don't have an award as yet, I sense it's coming with the type of writing and reading that we got. So is it that always already black life ought to be circumscribed or governed through exceptionalism, right? So those are some of the moments I just wanted to put out. I think I'll close on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Marlon. I feel like by serendipity or by curatorial genius, you were the perfect person to kind of close the sessions for us. We still have a reading to come this evening, but in terms of these sessions where we're laying ideas on the table and entering into conversation together, what a beautiful sort of summary that's also an opening. You know, you've addressed everybody who's spoken. It's very beautiful. Thank you very much. I think you are a writer. I think you're a poet.
You have to be mindful how you take up those spaces in this particular department, the type of reading and writing that went by. So.
Maybe I'll ask a question of the panel before we leave to the room. Lisa Lowe is very much on my mind on the panel. Two of you have spoken to her, and I think Suzette, you also actually do, though you didn't mention her name. I'm thinking about that moment in The Intimacies of Four Continents where she talks about the production of capital production as a production of whiteness, as a production of the complete subject, right? Remember that passage? And then for those of us who are not the ones being produced as full subjects, the full subjects of capitalism, we're also the full subjects of colonialism, we don't get to sort of, all of those intimacies and all the production of the self doesn't accrue to us in the same kind of way, and it's why we experience ourselves as abject, as fragmented, as discontinuous. That thought for me resonates with what you were saying, Marlon, about the inventory without a trace?
The Gransky
That's
School, right?
Gramsci, yeah, okay.
Selection of prison notebooks, page 324.
Thank you very much. I need to go and read that Gramsci. And I guess I just wonder if that connects to what Suzette is saying about the necessity of ordinary narrative. And then again, what Josh is saying about this question of coming into being. And if there's a connection, like a line that could be drawn through the three talks, thinking in that kind of way. So it's a seeking of a wholeness when the wholeness hasn't been made for you, right? And that then we don't sort of get to have the fullness of our feeling or the fullness of our being. And if there's a way of thinking about, I don't know, writing that being now, like if this is what, in fact, Suzette is doing in her novels, or what Josh is doing through his poetry, a new creative attempt to kind of write that being whole, and perhaps unremarkable, but maybe quite remarkable, maybe it's hauntedness or something. Thinking about all the thinking about haunting that you've been doing, but I think, for Karina is also very much a thing, thinking about mourning and haunting in order to have being.
I guess I would say in terms of capital production and mirroring truthness or a holistic image of myself as an Indigenous person is like thinking it's like a perfect utopia, like, especially in terms of the CanLit and all the shit that happened this year.
It's ongoing.
Yeah, it's ongoing, and who knows when that'll end, but keep that fire burning, I say. I think it's wishful thinking. For me, and I think a lot of Indigenous writers right now, and a lot of BIPOC writers who I've just been speaking with and networking with and sharing a story with and sharing space with, I've just been saying like, okay, what is CanLit? Who is CanLit? And I don't want to be CanLit. So like removing oneself from that space, I think removes us from that kind of preordained mandate that this is who you must become. That kind of like manifest destiny style. This is what indigeneity looks like. This is what it's going to be. So I'm really drawn to that Gransky quote that you kind of brought for us. This idea of like infinite traces without inventory shapes how we come to know ourselves. And I just kind of again think like this idea of like a wholeness is kind of wishful thinking, and that my life has always kind of been traced through infinite and kind of infinitesimal traces that are haunting, that are painful, that are traumatic, but that are resilient and that are triumphant as well. Like Rainbow is totally thinking along the same lines as you. When you're saying like it took you like 20 years to kind of come into yourself, and I'm in the same kind of boat where like 20 years to kind of unlearn those kind of colonized, desires or intimacies to call me like, Indian is dirty, drunk, disease, dying, etc., to kind of come into that, to undo that. And then the 2-3 years to kind of come into myself as a two-spirit person, having to navigate through the whiteness as queerness, and having to kind of go through those traumas, sexual traumas of Indigenous histories around queerness. So like when people like ask my age, like I'm always lying. Because I really always kind of return to this conception of Indian time, and the delay. And I think about, again, I kind of return to rain, and I'm drawn to Marlon. It's like this idea of like a type of history that's embedded in our thinking and our being. And I think that it's always kind of shattered, it's always kind of broken, it's always kind of this collage of, I think, infinite traces of past, present, and future, which I think all kind of coalesce to create a being that is holistic and whole and vivacious and vicious, but a mode of being that is kind of founded and crafted through ruptures and breakages. And I think there's beauty in that.
Yeah.
Rather than having to be seen as this kind of the perfect man, the consolidated whole.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
specifically for BIPOC and queer BIPOC, queer and trans folks, like the wholeness is always going to be a ruptured being.
Yeah.
But there's that ruptured being, that abjectness doesn't have to be something. If you can kind of change the descriptor of that, it can also be something that's reclaimed and something that's livable
Right.
and something that can procure a future.
So it's like you need to rebalance it affectively.
Yeah, shift the story.
Yeah, change the story.
Because I just
When
think
you ratchet your age, do you ratchet it up or down?
it depends if it's like a grant agency, or if it's a date. It's usually down. But
That makes sense as a question, Suzette.
Of course it does. It's a really hard question, and I think that, I think this idea of what you just said, Josh, about wholeness is wishful thinking, and that kind of beauty and ruptured beauty, I think that's such a great way of putting it. I don't really have a great answer. I think I just want to ask more questions. Like, Marlon, when I think you wrote, or I think you said, and I was just writing so quickly, I hope I wrote it down right, where you said, should Black life be governed through exceptionalism? I really wanted to know more about what you meant by that, because maybe that's the opposite of what I'm saying, or is it?
So,
Like, are you talking about Black life in this, like,
No,
this life, or
I
are you
think-
talking about like in fiction or in real?
well, I think, is it that as Blackness works to shift from that material currency of plantationism, to come to understand what it means to be human, is it that the only singular homogeneous conclusion speaks to exceptionalism, right? So is it that for Black life to be recognized, because to me it's sort of a neoliberal moment, right? You have to meet the interests of the market in a particular way,
Yeah.
right? To become this sort of a capitalist subject of modernity, and if you fit within those capillary-like moments and you give them currency, you're recognized. So for Black life to be recognized. Now, but I understand that as a possibility, but the only possibility that we ought to be embodied titles of presidency, which laden with all these problematics, PhDs, esteemed writers, that's I think Fanon is asking us to understand a different form of what it means to be human. It doesn't, where I'm touching on, it speaks to Foucault's notion of biopolitics, that this idea of exceptionalism forms a mode of inclusion as well as a mode of exclusion, right? And what happens when it becomes a singular possibility and it's made intelligible and installed within our quotidian everyday life. So it's a very complex moment, and I not want it to be lost or reduced. Yeah.
Yeah, I do have a bunch of comments and questions really. So one of the things, because I have the privilege of traveling a lot, is trying to figure out when that exceptionalism is because white people are just catching up with what James Baldwin says, which is that Black people understand ourselves and white people. Do you know what I mean? Where it's like, oh, you're just catching up. And part of that, Joshua, I just love your work. Thank you. Thinking through like coding in my family, like this concept that Black people do not code. Like I remember, or aren't like cyber powwow, for example, like BBSing, like this idea that we were never there. And I think to kind of think through, and so we had a small conversation around plantation stuff, which is, I have very mixed feelings about that, and I know from my own community, people are pushing back on that. And the New World Group talked about it in the 60s, and it was really powerful, but then it overtook us where we couldn't imagine that we had other relationships necessarily, how we were structured with one another. So the librarian back home at the National Library was like, can you see on your travels you can find any other way in which we've been talking about how we talk to one another? I guess I'll use one example. I guess when you're thinking about exceptionalism, Suzanne, I really appreciate what you're saying around how we're constructed, because I feel that how it's impressed on me when I moved through BC, right? You do what? So I'll use the example of GIS. So I'm a weird, complicated being. I like GIS. That's something that I follow. Authorship, which, yeah, I'll leave it there. More please. It's so, yeah, stop there.
Josh?
much.
I would say in terms of the possibilities of co-authorship, I've done several papers and I'm working on one right now with my MA advisor, Jenny Wills, who's actually one of my best friends too. So she was doing her talk, or half the paper on her experiences as a Korean Canadian adoptee, and I was doing mine as the son of his father who was picked up to the 60 scoop and placed through CFS. And the stories resonated so strongly together. And because we started doing this kind of, co-writing together, like, it was such a strong bond and such a shared pain, and we could see the ways in which her subject position and her livelihood as a Korean Canadian adoptee, and mine as the son of his father taken to the 60s scoop, like they were so similar. So like we were creating this amazing kinship through the sharing of stories and the kind of putting the pain on the table and making it animate, and then being able to like make love to that and like transform it. So I think like the possibilities of co-writing in the arts, in creative or critical disciplines, like especially for BIPOC folks or like disempowered folks of any sort, is just it's so transformative, and I think it radically shifts how we think about things like dissertations, or how we think of things like the novel or a poem. And at the same time, as I was writing it, my bit, as coming to myself as the son of someone from the 60s scoop, I was like, okay, but now I need to say like my father is a co-author, because this is his story too that I'm telling, his father. So like I don't think any singular story is any story is singularly owned, but we just like to make those peripheral, make those traces and say, oh, I did this. But that's when I did my my speech for the Talent's 50th, when I did my book launch, I said, like, yes, I curated these stories, but they're not mine. This is my community stories too. So I think co-authorship is a powerful mode to kind of reshift and rethink about how we kind of navigate academic or institutional spaces or exceptionalism, but it's always there. It's just, we have to kind of put a name to it, right? Singular stamp.
And I think it's also really important to remember that authorship is a really specific Western historical construction, right? That arises out of a particular moment in European history. So that's why we still need our historical requirement. But yeah, but to make that recognition, sorry, what?
Terrible inside joke there.
Yeah, I know. We've just been having a discussion about the historical requirement, course requirement, in our department just yesterday. Yeah, was it yesterday? It was yesterday. I mean, I think it's important to make the recognition. I would make it genealogically rather than actually having a historical requirement. But just to recognize that, right? That it's a particular specific cultural production that emerges out of a really particular specific cultural moment in European literary history. That for those of us who don't come from that history, or come from that history as one history among many, that there's no particular reason to be beholden to it as a form. It's another form that can be broken, right?
Especially when it's so loudly proclaimed the author's dead. So.
The author. Yeah, right, exactly. And that whole thing about, that whole argument about the death of the author as well, also belonging to another moment in European literary history. And that moment happens to be the moment when many of us who are not white, right, who are indigenous, who are black, who are Asian, are just kind of entering into that possibility of voice and that possibility of speaking as an author, which is a reason to hang on to it, maybe. But I think it's, it's as you say, you want the fragmentation, you want the reverb, like you want, to sort of, to be able to have it in one hand and not in the other. Yeah. Well, are we just like plum tuckered out? I apologize for eating. I hit a moment where blood sugar was just like, right. Didn't notice it. Didn't put it on Twitter, so it didn't happen. Well, I thank you all so much for a really extraordinary day.